Thank you, Peter. And Peter somehow forgot. Uh-oh.
No, you push it, yeah.
I think Peter somehow forgot to mention that my best collaborator here was Peter Lessica. No, but and it's so nice to be here while I get this microphone adjusted. I just want to say it's so nice. Is this working? Picking up correctly? It is very nice to be here and see many, many familiar faces in the audience. This is really spectacular turnout for a Friday night with beautiful weather that you're all here in a classroom to talk about pollinator gardens. So I'll just jump right into it. Let's see if I can get this working. So to frame this, I just want to remind you all that in the 20th century, people in the United States started thinking about conservation. And they thought about conservation in terms of wilderness areas and in terms of creating things like the National Park Service, the National Forest Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Private organizations like the Nature Conservancy were founded in the mid-1950s, mostly to conserve land, although they've kind of evolved since then. And so, the idea was that nature is somehow separate from people and we leave towns and cities to find it. But one of the things we didn't realize until the, at least second half, probably last decades of the 20th century, was that you can't confine nature to parks and preserves. And so we've been seeing all these signals of population decline, and people have started to say, well, what else can we do? And one thing that now in the 21st century, we're starting to focus attention for nature on rewilding towns and cities, at least to the extent of bringing resources for wildlife like pollinators into our cities. Now, I'm saying this in Missoula, Montana. We may never be happy with wolves and bears in our cities. That's a different issue. But things like songbirds and butterflies and bees can coexist very happily with people. And examples of this switch to also not abandoning our national parks, please don't abandon our national parks and forests, but also thinking about conservation in towns and cities. One example is the Million Pollinator Garden Challenge. This is from about 5 years ago when we already surpassed 1 million. It was launched by the Obama administration. Similarly, Doug Tallamy's Homegrown National Park Initiative is encouraging people to plant native plant gardens throughout the landscape in towns and cities. And so that's the framing for my talk, but before, and I'm so excited about rewilding towns and cities and bringing pollinator gardens into the landscape. But pollinator gardens are hard to plant. This is just one random figure I pulled from the internet about guidelines for planting a pollinator garden. And it's really complicated and not very specific. And so one of the problems we run into in trying to implement and make pollinator gardens popular, I mean, here I'm speaking to the choir probably, is that we actually don't really know what pollinators need in gardens. We have some good guesses. And sometimes the materials we need are really hard to source, or the expertise. I mean, you can't just run down to the, Ace Hardware store on a weekend, or what is it, Karis Nursery here? Do I remember that correctly? And find your favorite native plant and plunk it in your garden and have it survive the way you might be able to many of the cultivated plants that we've bred for that purpose. So today, that's the novel ecosystems part to foreshadow the end of the talk. Today, I'm going to talk to you for most of my time about a complicated story of monarch butterflies in California. And then we're going to use that to talk about how hard it is to create the perfect pollinator garden, and that it's okay to not create a perfect pollinator garden. How many of you have heard about monarch butterflies and parasites in coastal California? Okay, this is a new story for many of you. The work I'll be talking about here involves data that was largely collected by a former postdoc of mine, Emily Erickson, who was my first lab group member at UC Davis when I moved west. She was there before I was. And she now works for a consulting firm called Second Nature Ecology and Design. And I wanted to mention that they design wildlife and pollinator-friendly landscaping for clients like Google and towns and cities in California and throughout the world. And that emphasizes the growing interest in pollinator gardening. But she walked many miles to show you the data we'll get to. Before we get there, though, I will introduce you to monarch butterflies. Monarch butterflies are these beautiful orange individuals we see here, but of course, like any butterfly, they have a complex life cycle. The adult butterflies lay little tiny eggs on leaves of milkweed plants. Those eggs hatch and are tiny caterpillars. The caterpillars get really big and keep eating leaves, and then they pupate sometimes in surprising places. This is a picture from Berkeley, California, of a pupa on a drainage ditch. And so those are the basic life stages if you're looking for monarch butterflies in your garden. Also, just to remind you some basic butterfly biology, butterflies consume plants during 2 life stages. So as adults, butterflies don't necessarily eat milkweed, and they certainly don't eat leaves. They collect nectar from a variety of different plant species. That nectar gives them flight. It makes them, the energy to fly. It gives them longevity. They live longer with more nectar. And it gives you about half of the sugar. It's my favorite fun fact about butterflies. About half of the sugar they use for reproduction comes from the nectar they eat as adults, but about half comes from the leaves they eat as caterpillars. So they have larval host plants that are growth and some reproduction, and many butterflies, not just monarchs, are narrow specialists on some particular plant species as caterpillars. So if you want to have a butterfly garden, you need to think about diverse plants flowering throughout the summer for the adults, but also what species they eat as caterpillars. And of course, monarch butterflies eat milkweeds. How many of you have heard that monarch butterflies lay their eggs on milkweeds? Excellent. So that's the only plant, well, broadly the only plant that they can survive on as caterpillars. But milkweeds are not just one plant species. There are dozens of milkweed species in the United States. I don't expect you to absorb everything in this graph, although if you'd like to come up and look at it, you can get it from Monarch Joint Venture online also. But there are dozens of milkweed species in the United States that monarch butterflies use. They differ in their phenology, the timing of their leaf out and flowering. They differ in their habitat requirements. And so there are lots of native milkweed species in North America. Continuing to just bring everyone up to speed on monarch butterfly life cycles, this is a map of monarch butterfly migration. And there are 3 distinct populations of monarch butterflies in North America. The most famous is the one that overwinters in Mexico. And then adult butterflies, starting in early spring, fly north into Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, and Georgia, where they breed for their first generation. Their offspring then fly to places like Iowa and Virginia. Some of them stay there. They breed there. Some of the third generation stays there. Some of it flies further north into southern Canada. So this is the thing. And then at the end of the year, the last generation of monarchs flies all the way back down to Mexico to overwinter where their great or great-great-grandparents did. And that is one of the most amazing phenomena in biology. It's not what's happening in California and not even what's happening in Western Montana. Our monarch butterflies, Western monarch butterflies, overwinter on the coast of California, that red band there up and down the coast. And if any of you have been to the forests in Santa Barbara or Monterey, Pacific Grove, Santa Cruz, have any of you visited those California monarch butterfly groves where you see the trees covered with monarchs as if they're leaves? Those are also overwintering populations of monarch butterflies. And those monarch butterflies leave the trees in early spring, about February. They go and breed somewhere in the California Coast Range or Central Valley or maybe the edge of the Sierras. Then their offspring, some of them stay there, some of them fly a little bit further east into Utah, Nevada, and then Utah. Some of them fly north into Oregon. So we also have 3 or 4 summer generations of monarch butterflies sort of filling the western states, and then they all fly back to coastal California in the summer. So that's two of them, and maybe there's some mixing between the populations, maybe there's not, but there's definitely two distinct phenomena. And then the third population is that there are monarch butterflies in South Florida that don't migrate at all. It's warm there year round, they live there year round. So what we're gonna focus on today, since I live in California now, and since they are, we think the monarch butterflies that come, actually, Montana's kind of a crazy place, we don't know where your monarchs come from. So you might be getting them from either side, but I'm gonna focus on the California ones today. And the California ones, I was lured into thinking about them even before I moved to California, because so people in the Xerces Society and my longstanding collaborator Cheryl Schultz, shown here from Washington State University, asked me to help them do statistical analyses of this time series, which is the number of monarch butterflies counted, the Xerces Society for Conservation, the same ones I was talking to some of you about, the Bumblebee Atlas, does a winter count up and down the California coast of monarch butterflies. These the orange dots are their counts during the past few years. The black dots are some magic statistics that Cheryl and I did to extrapolate from naturalist reports and published data, what it was like in the past. And this is a log scale, so 1 unit is 10 times bigger. So in the 1980s, when I was in high school, there were millions of monarch butterflies on the California coast. In the 1990s, they had some erratic fluctuations down to hundreds of thousands. In the 2000s, they kind of were settled at 200,000 or 300,000 monarch butterflies on the California coast. And then in 2018, they started having these crazy dramatic fluctuations, where 1 year, a couple years in a row, there were about 30,000. 200,000, 30,000, that's kind of scary, you barely see them. And then in 2020, when everything was going wrong, we counted only about 2,000 monarch butterflies on the whole California coast. And then the next year it was 200,000, and then 300,000, and then last year it was 9,000 again. I can't tell you why they're fluctuating like that. I can tell you that this has raised a lot of special concern about monarch butterflies in California, especially people who live on the coast who are used to being able to drive to these beautiful overwintering sites, and suddenly half the time they could barely find a monarch there. So, oh, that was supposed to acknowledge the Xerces Society for counting. So, you know, we're going to take a little step away from that for a moment. So this is the overwintering and the migratory monarchs. But there are also non-migratory monarchs. I mentioned them in Florida, but they actually occur throughout the world. So everywhere I circled here are non-migratory monarch butterfly populations. There are monarch butterfly populations in Florida and Cuba and Central and South America that don't migrate. There have been non-migratory populations in Los Angeles and San Diego along the coast of Southern California that don't migrate since at least the 1970s. They somehow naturally colonized Hawaii and Guam, and thankfully they choose not to migrate from there. They colonized Australia, and it's not clear whether they migrate there. They're in Morocco and Spain and don't do much migrating there. So although we think that like the historical baseline ancestral state of monarchs is this migratory tendency, there's lots of places where monarchs don't migrate. But in Northern California, where I now live, there seems to be a new phenomenon of monarch butterflies that don't migrate and spend the whole year living in coastal California. And that started in about 2008, 2009, 2000. Sorry, yeah, anyway, I'll show you a graph in a minute. It started not that long ago. I might be off by a decade in saying this, it might be even more recent. About the same time, monarch butterflies started showing these big declines in the migratory region. So here's my slide, winter breeding in Northern California coastal cities. These red blobs here are cities where people have been reporting non-migratory monarch butterflies in Southern California since the 70s, in Northern California more recently. So here is some data that another Washington State University ecologist, David James, put together of high naturalist sightings, and yes, I was off by a decade, time flies. So this was starting around the late 2010s. in 2018 or 2019, people started reporting overwintering monarch butterflies, but not on the trees, hanging out and breeding in people's yards in Oakland and Berkeley and San Jose and those cities around. San Francisco itself, by the way, is like too cold and wet still, too cloudy. We did a different analysis that is harder to understand, but scientifically more rigorous. So if any of you are like, haven't just more people been using iNaturalist recently in our analysis, we also saw our metric of how many resident monarch butterflies there were going up through time. So the reason that monarch butterflies can now live and breed year-round in coastal California is because there are these evergreen milkweed species. So normally, if you plant a milkweed in your yard in Montana, it dies back in the winter, right? I mean, here you have snow, but even if I plant mine in Davis, California, where we just get a cold, rainy season in the winter, it dies back. But there are places in tropical climates where milkweeds are evergreen little shrubby plant, shrubs and trees. And so here are two examples of popular horticultural evergreen milkweeds. Tropical milkweed, how many of you have heard of tropical milkweed? Yeah, it's kind of infamous. Is this one? It's got these beautiful flowers. It's native to Central and South America and very popular horticulture. Balloon plant milkweed is less well known here, but is also common in gardens in the San Francisco Bay suburbs, where it can grow. It's native to Africa, and it makes these kind of funky and cool horticulturally balloon-like pots. And the concerns about, so there's evergreen milkweeds, therefore monarchs have habitat, why migrate? And so they're living there, and there are two concerns about tropical milkweed. One is that non-migratory monarch butterflies have high levels of a protozoan parasite, Ophriocistis electroscira. Everyone calls it OE. And here's a healthy monarch butterfly. Here's one that emerged symptomatic with OE. If we look at the proportion of heavily infected monarch butterflies at overwintering sites in Southern California, this was work done actually not 10 years ago, not by me, or year-round breeding sites. The year-round breeding sites have really high levels of OE infection, and the overwintering ones don't. And so that's obviously a concern that there are a lot of sick monarchs there. And so because of that, counties in California and the state consider tropical milkweed in particular, I don't know why it gets picked out over balloon plant, a noxious weed. And it's not a noxious weed like knapweed in Montana. It naturalizes a little bit, but you don't see whole fields of it taking over everything. But they're concerned that it's pulling our monarch butterflies. And that's part of what motivated our research. People have known for a long time that non-migratory monarchs have high levels of OE. This is Sonia Altizer, a professor at the University of Georgia, who did her PhD about the same time I did, and who studied the fact that this is the proportion of heavily, I'm going to nerd you out on science a little bit in this section, hopefully that's okay. So here's some data. Here, the proportion of heavily infected monarch butterflies, samples she compiled through time. The eastern migratory population, very low OE. The western migratory population, higher OE. She didn't even think about non-migratory ones in the west back then, but the Florida resident population, very highly infected. And the idea here is two things. One is that if the pathogen is spread by having spores on the leaves. So a parent lays eggs, its spores come off it onto the leaves, the little eggs hatch, they eat the leaves and they eat some spores. If the plant dies back every year, maybe the spores don't build up as much on it. Certainly, or maybe I should say if it's evergreen, maybe the spores build up more, although we haven't really been able to easily measure spore levels on leaves. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that migration purges the disease. So meaning that the infected ones can't make it to Mexico or the California coast and die. So at an individual level, more are dying with the disease, and that means at a population level, fewer have the disease. So it's a really complicated thing. And if you're like, whoa, this is a lot of science for 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock on a Friday night, the important thing to know is that it's pretty complicated. So the first question that I asked when I came into this system some years ago was, can heavily infected monarch populations persist? Could a population like that one in Florida persist on its own, or does it need input from the migratory population? Could a population like the ones on our coastal cities that don't migrate persist without influx? Are we draining them out of this migratory population? And what I did was almost a high school algebra problem, where I took all these estimates that Sonia had measured in her dissertation, but never looked at in this way, of things like adult survival of healthy and infected monarch butterflies. And so the adult ones have about an 80% chance of surviving every day in the field. The infected ones have more like a 40% chance. And then we can look at the number of eggs they lay per day. We can look at the proportion of those eggs that survive to be adults. And then we can just say, what's the probability that, what's the number of healthy adults, or sorry, adults that survive to adulthood laid by one adult for healthy and infected. And you can think about how you do that as a high school algebra problem, or you can just look at the slide. And here we have the per generation growth rate of monarch butterflies. So if this number is 1, the population size stays the same. It's like a multiplier. And if it's 2, it's doubling. And if it's less than 1, it's getting smaller and it can't persist. So for 5% OE, typical of the healthy eastern population, they can get a 2.5 to 3-fold increase per generation. That's how they grow and fill all of eastern North America or all of the western states. But for resident populations with 75% OE, they're still increasing by about 5% per generation, and they can persist. And then if you do a little bit more algebra and say, but those ones that are migratory have to fly all the way back to California coast or Mexico and survive the winter, then in fact, the growth rates are about the same on an annual basis for the migratory ones with low infection, but that have to do all that traveling and some of them die, and the non-migratory ones that live in people's gardens. And maybe that's not surprising, because for a lot of centuries, there have been non-migratory ones in some parts of the world and migratory ones in other parts of the world. Okay, so the costs of infection are similar to the costs of migration. It is true that non-migratory monarchs have high levels of this parasite, but that doesn't mean they can't persist. That's a really bad double negative. In spite of having high levels of the parasite, they can persist in cities. So the other thing that people were worried about is that milkweed near these overwintering sites will pull monarchs out of the migration and have them live in cities, so that the city population is growing every year and the migratory population is declining every year, because just like humans, maybe the monarchs are moving from the country to the cities. Not all humans, obviously, you're still here. But is Missoula a city? I don't know. Anyway, and this was inspired, again, I'm gonna nerd out a little bit and show you some studies by work done by students of Sonia Altheiser's at University of Georgia. So these are the eastern monarchs. This is a map of Texas, where the eastern monarchs are coming down from Minnesota to get to Mexico and flying through Texas, not far from Georgia up there where it says fall. And in Texas, some monarchs seem to at least stop during their fall migration and hang out in people's gardens in kind of, I think this is Houston here. And these are graphs that are kind of funky, but basically it's the proportion of monarchs. They can tell if you take a monarch and kill it and bring it into the lab and look at its chemistry, what species of milkweed it was eating. And so they killed a bunch of monarchs to find out what they were eating at different times of year. And they found out that during this fall migration period, those black bars are bigger, meaning that more of the monarchs in these resident gardens were coming from the migratory population. They also saw that the proportion in these gardens around Houston that had OE went down because of these migratory ones that were healthy coming through. So And then they did a second study. I think this was Dara Satterfield on top, her PhD. And then Anya Majewska, who some of you might have known because she did a master's degree at University of Montana when I was here in Tom Martin's lab. But she switched cleverly from birds to butterflies for her PhD. So she did an experiment where she, maybe I'll just explain it. You can look at the slide if you want. She took monarch butterflies, reared them in the lab, and got them to be in sort of migratory behavioral mode or breeding mode. And then she also harvested them from outside. And whatever mode they're in, if you offer them milkweed that's fresh during their migration, they'll be like, some fraction of them will be like, maybe we should stop and breed. So from these data, a lot of people became very worried that tropical milkweed was not only making sick monarch butterflies, but pulling them out of the population. So we wanted to know if the same thing was happening in California. This is where Emily comes in. We designed a number of routes. This is the Oakland Berkeley, for those of you who are Californian, East Bay area of San Francisco. Each of these colored lines is a route that Emily walked once a month for a year. So she spent about 2 weeks a month walking around to neighborhoods in Berkeley and Oakland. And luckily her parents lived there because this is about a 45-minute drive from UC Davis where we're based. And she did these monthly field surveys for a year. She counted the number of adults she saw. She looked at the proportion OE infected. She also collected some data on the density of milkweeds and number of caterpillars that I won't have time to see you today. We also did a handful of these routes once a month in 2023. We took a year off to analyze them in 2024, but we're back now in 2025 because it was kind of interesting. And the idea is that if we were going to see the same thing that they saw in Georgia and Texas, what we'd expect to see is if this is a graph of month of the year and the number of adult butterflies, we'd expect to see a big influx in fall when the migration is coming through, of them stopping and hanging out in our gardens. So we'd expect to see, during the fall migration, a big influx of butterflies, then the population staying fairly constant, and then declining through the year. Through the winter, when it's not, through the summer, when it's not getting the input. That's not what we saw. What we saw was, in fact, now this is graphed a little differently, but this is the months of the fall migration. The population was dropping then, probably because it was getting a little cooler and less optimal for monarch butterflies during the winter, although they do persist at low levels breeding in the winter and then grow in the summer when it's warm. So they're acting like a population that's doing its own thing, not one that's being fed by the migration. We also looked at the proportion of infected monarch butterflies. If we were, the migratory ones were coming in and supporting our urban population, we'd expect proportion of infected to go down during migration because of all the uninfected monarchs coming in. It might look something like this, but that's not what we saw. What we saw was this pattern, where if anything, there's an increase in infection during these months when the population is dropping. So population is getting smaller, infection is increasing. This does not sound like migratory monarchs are moving in and supporting the population during the winter. We also saw in our second year of surveys, this is the graph of the year when I showed you all the data, the routes that we continued to walk the next year. The next year was a colder winter. There were fewer monarch butterflies. They laid fewer larvae, and they had a much lower fraction of infected individuals, possibly because the population was smaller, possibly because the infection doesn't spread so much when it's cold, but no sign that this was just being driven by the migratory population doing its own thing. So the first concern that they have high levels of the parasite is true, but it doesn't prevent the population from persisting. The second concern that it's pulling monarchs out of the migration does not seem to be the case in the East. Well, we did our work in the East Bay. I'm applying it to the South Bay for those of you who are Californians, where there are also monarch butterflies living year round. So for this monarch butterfly story, we have this non-native, naturalizing, and commonly planted species. Is it good or bad for monarch butterflies? The answer is it depends. If we're interested in the migratory population and nothing else, maybe we want to get rid of this from the precautionary principle. But if we want people in cities to see monarch butterflies, we want to keep these tropical milkweeds in cities. And you might also, someone who's kind of a tropical milkweed hater from the East Coast emailed me when we published this paper. And he's like, well, what about all the monarchs that die from OE? Isn't that cruel? And that it depends on whether you care about individual monarchs versus population persistence. Although when we've reared monarchs in the lab, we see way more than we expect of infected but asymptomatic monarch butterflies in the West. So there might be something more to figure out about. And so there's this balance of costs and benefits, but we don't see, maybe there's some increase in encounters of migrants with this parasite because of the resident population, but we don't see it bringing them to hell in a handbasket. Remember, some counties have outlawed this plant because they were worried that it was bad for monarchs, or outlawed the sale of it. They're not going to come give you a ticket for having it in your garden. Although there was one conservation group that was coming around giving flyers to people on the routes we were walking. And some of them were like, but I don't want to get rid of my milkweed and my monarchs. Even if we took out the evergreen one and planted a native milkweed, it would die back in the winter and we wouldn't have our monarchs year round, right? And I was like, tell them it's for science. You can keep it. So, and I think this is where I fall in the end, that, for this particular very complicated situation, the benefits of increasing public awareness and having people working with monarch butterflies way outweigh the potential conservation risks. And maybe it's different in the East Coast. I'm not going to argue with people in Texas and Florida and Georgia about what they should do, but I am encouraging, counties and state governments and conservation groups to back off on telling homeowners to stop planting tropical milkweed. So, even if I want to say we really don't know what to do in this situation, we still, even in coastal California, know how to help monarchs. We know that it never hurts to plant native milkweeds if you want to, although some conservationists would even debate me on that because maybe even native milkweed would lure them out of the migration. I've heard people say this. I've been emailed by people. I think we still know that monarchs and many other butterflies and pollinators need gardens with diverse nectar plant species for all the reasons I mentioned before. And we also know, after moving to California, I have someone who comes and knocks on my door every year and asks if they want me to spray pesticide for my spiders. And I like my spiders. They probably don't know what I do for a living, but we use pesticides without thinking very carefully about it in our culture. And so finding ways to use pesticides only when you need to is one of the best things you can do for insect conservation. You guys are probably not going to be encountering coastal California gardens. I realize I left this in here after talking to master gardeners in coastal California. But if you are in this situation, if you want to minimize OE, you might find a time to cut back your evergreen milkweeds when they're not being used by monarchs to not have infected leaves around. And you also don't necessarily want to rear monarchs indoors where you might be spreading the disease. So that's my long and complicated monarch butterfly story. But what does it mean for pollinator gardens if you don't live in coastal California and don't have to be scratching your head about whether to plant non-native milkweeds that give you more monarchs but non-natural monarchs? Well, one thing is that especially in these arid and Mediterranean climates, which Missoula is kind of on the edge. When I lived in Massachusetts, fall came because it got cold, and that was the end of the growing season. Living in California, the end of the growing season comes because it gets dry. I'm not sure where Missoula is in the middle there, but when you can extend the blooming period by irrigating your gardens, lots of pollinator life cycles change. And so while we were doing these monarch butterfly surveys, we noticed these big, beautiful bumblebees, Bombus bosnicenskii, our most common West Coast bumblebee, flying around in this funky helicopter reconnaissance-like pattern in January. And this reconnaissance type pattern means they're searching for a place to start a nest. And they're not supposed to be doing that in January. Just as a little reminder, if you're not a bumblebee aficionado, this is the textbook picture of a bumblebee life cycle. What they're supposed to do is hibernate in the winter, then queens emerge in the spring, they fly around doing their reconnaissance and find a place to make a nest. Then they disappear after they have some workers to go forage for them. The workers forage in the summer. Then at the end of the growing season, the colony switches to reproduction and produces queens and males. Males fly off and mate with someone who's not their sister, and only the newly mated queens survive the winter. Everyone else dies at the end of the year. So, and if you wanted to draw this on a circle of the whole year, and when you would see queens, you would see queens nest searching in spring. You'd see them foraging a little bit after that as they need to feed their first set of children. And then you wouldn't see them all. And then you might see them out foraging before they hibernate in fall, although that's actually pretty rare. It's common that they do it, but it's rare that we see them for reasons we don't understand. They're sneaky. So my grad student Sylvie Finn started walking with Emily, and together they collected this data on sightings of bumblebee queens throughout the year in the gardens of Berkeley and Oakland and the East Bay in California, where these green bars are all the nest searching queens they found 9 months out of the year instead of 2 or 3. And then the yellow bars are foraging queens they found flying. They saw 11 months of the year. And basically, it's not just tropical milkweed being evergreen that's changing the life cycle of monarch butterflies. It's watered plants that flower throughout the year, which every gardener loves, that's changing the life cycle of bumblebees. And these might be 2 of the most extreme, but we started thinking about all kinds of different pollinators. These are pipeline swallowtails. They don't make it as far north as Montana, at least not yet. I think it'll take a long time for them to get here. They're actually just invading Massachusetts, but only occasionally. But they sometimes have 1 generation of butterflies a year and sometimes have 2. And what we're seeing is that people like to plant their larval host plant, California pipevine, in their gardens. And in spring, they're on pipevine in nature, eating and reproducing. And in summer, the only caterpillar species surviving are in the irrigated gardens. And that's good because we're helping these beautiful butterflies live. These are like these are now more abundant than monarchs in California, and they're equally spectacular. They're just blue-black big butterflies flying around in gardens and forests. But you know, we're saving a second generation, but that's not very natural. In fact, in nature, we're like, why do we even see butterflies? Because none of their caterpillars are surviving. So there are a lot of ways in which gardens that we plant for pollinators differ from natural habitat. We're extending the flowering period by planting long blooming, or in some cases, evergreen cultivars, or evergreen plants. We add supplemental water. In some climates, you have an urban heat island that makes the growing season start a little sooner and end a little later. And, you know, maybe we can control by focusing on native plants, the first one, but I don't even know if we want to, because the long blooming is providing more resources for the pollinators and maybe saving them in years of extreme drought in nature by supplemental watering. And there's nothing you can do as a gardener to control the urban heat island. But that's not the only thing. In a garden, you also have high species diversity at very small scales. So you have lots of different plants in your yard, and that might not be the way that plants are clustered in nature. You get bigger patches of one species and not everything all mixed together at the same time. At larger scales, yards are a unique issue when we think about pollinator habitat on the landscape, because every person owns their land and is managing it individualistically. So if we wanted to create something that mimics natural habitat in cities, you'd have to have like a homeowners organization telling everyone what to do, and then people wouldn't want to do it because who wants to be told what to do? So, you know, it's just, that's why I call them novel ecosystems. They're going to be a different thing. Okay, so does that mean we should give up on pollinator gardens as a conservation strategy? Well, probably you won't be surprised, my answer is no. I really love pollinator gardens in towns and cities. And so in my last 5 minutes, I'm just gonna talk to you about all the reasons they're good, even if they're not imitating natural habitat. And one reason is because there's actually not a lot of evidence that pollinator gardens need to be great. Okay, this is another slide from the Altizer Lab at University of Georgia. They're like the unknown co-authors of this presentation. But Anya Maeshka, the one who did her master's degree here at University of Montana, did a review with Sonia Altizer of all the studies that have been done of pollinators that we see in gardens. And so this graph here is just about each bar represents a study that had been done by the time they published this 5 years ago. And you know, this is a tiny little graph. I don't know if you can see it, but this first line says, does it matter whether or not you have native or non-native plants in your flower garden? Not native plants versus weeds or turf grass. And the answer is no. This graph says, does it matter how many flowers you have in your yard? And the answer is yes. This graph says, does it matter how many different species of plant you have in your yard? And it says, if you have more plant species, you see more insect species. So it's important to have gardens designed for pollinators, but for pollinators, it doesn't really matter whether those plants are native as long as they're providing resources. And for those of you who are fans, how many of you have read Doug Tallamy's book? It's kind of an East Coast thing, but I see some hands up. He argues hard for native plants and local genotypes. I think that's because he studies leaf-eating moths, and those caterpillars are very specialized. So if you want to keep little Lepidoptera and beetle diversity high too, you might think about native plants. But if you're just doing a first cut with butterflies and bees, you want flowers that provide pollen and nectar. Okay, so that's one reason is pollinator gardens need to be good, but they don't need to be great to support pollinators in general. Another reason is because even if the pollinator garden is, you know, actually bad for monarch butterflies in coastal California, I'm almost willing to take one for the team, because interacting with nature is really good for people. So Bob Heil, who I think started the Xerxes Society, had this fear of the extinction of experience cycle, where people would encounter nature less, that would make them not manage their yards or argue in public spaces for things to support wildlife. There would be few interactions with wildlife. That would make them less interested in wildlife because they don't know what it is. That would make them even less likely to get this negative feedback. But if we can get people to have a positive feedback where more people are managing their gardens for wildlife, then they encounter wildlife more often in their yards, they care more about wildlife in their yards and in nature and in public spaces, and they invest more resources in it. And this graph is from a paper out of Emily Miner's lab at University of Illinois, Chicago, not University of Chicago, where she did work with birds and gardens in Chicago. And she hypothesized this very direct feedback, kind of funnily. What she actually saw was that your yard didn't really affect the number of birds in your yard when scientists surveyed them, but the neighborhood level did affect it. So if you happen to be in a neighborhood where lots of people do stuff for birds, you get more birds in your yard. But if you're managing birds in your yard, think you see more birds in your yard, and that increases your interest. And so there's a positive indirect feedback at the neighborhood scale for the birds, and a positive direct feedback for the people who are doing stuff for birds and now paying attention to birds. And so there are a lot of advantages for having gardens just to have gardens. And then the third advantage I will mention is that most people want to have a yard like their neighbors. This is a classic paper in urban ecology done by Joan Nassauer about 15 years ago, where she did surveys and asked people in the Detroit area if they were going to get a new house, what would they want their landscaping to look like? And some of them were told that all their neighbors would have green lawns. And most of them wanted green lawns, so I graphed her data, only I would be bold enough to put 3 points on a graph and draw a line through it. But this is the landscaping choice of their hypothetical neighbors. Joan would never be such a person. And then the popularity of prairie yards when they asked people what they want their landscaping to be like. And if they told people all their neighbors were gonna have lawns, almost no one chose a prairie. If they told people that almost all their neighbors were gonna have prairies or trees or showed them pictures of diverse yards, almost 90% of them, actually, for real data, were about 75% of them wanted to have a prairie yard. If they told them, you know, some neighbors were gonna have lawns, others were gonna have trees, others were gonna have prairies, about 50% of them wanted a prairie yard. So people want to do what their neighbors are doing. And one of my grad students followed up on this and looked at the distribution of front yard flower gardens in the greater Boston area. And she said, if you look at a flower garden like this place on the top, how many of its neighbors also have flower gardens? And if you look at a non-flower garden, how many of its neighbors have flower gardens? And this complicated graph says that if you look at the nearest neighbor of someone who has a flower garden, they're 3 times more likely to also have a flower garden than if you look at the, you know, than if you look at someone who doesn't have a flower garden. When you get out to about 10 or 20 neighbors, the effect goes away. So there's this very local process where flower gardening is spreading through the landscape because people like to imitate their neighbors. And I believe, although Atticus's data does not test this, that even if you don't plant a perfect flower garden, your neighbor will be like, oh, flowers are pretty. I'm gonna plant flowers too. And hopefully that will promote spread through the landscape. Yeah, and this is just summarizing this kind of complicated idea with this. This was our favorite block when we were ground truthing all those maps of flower gardens. We actually got them off Google Street View. I'd be happy to talk about that more, but I'm towards the end of my time. And this was our favorite block where everyone had a flower garden. When we were surveying, they would tell us about how they trade plants, get the ideas from their neighbors. So there are lots of reasons to like to have flower gardens. So I guess what I'll summarize is that, you know, it's hard to have a perfect pollinator garden. Yeah, so it's not the end of my talk. And now I'll summarize. Or I guess it's not the end of my summarize. But I like those of you who love them. So it's hard to have a perfect flower garden, a perfect pollinator garden. And then, you know, the long story I told you from coastal California highlights that because we don't even know what perfect is in this landscape. And I do believe that conservation groups trying to say this is unnatural, make it go away, we're probably having a net negative effect and just a confusing effect on the homeowners there. They're like, do we plant milkweed for flowers? Like, you know, when they go to the store and come back with a different cultivar of tropical milkweed or a balloon plant, like, see, I fixed it. So anyway, it's really hard to have a good garden, and maybe so that is the first thing. The second thing is that maybe it's impossible to really replicate nature in a city because the landscape is just different. And people will make different decisions and be idiosyncratic. Since we're not sure what's right, maybe that's an advantage. Someone will get it right and not everyone will get it wrong. And the third thing is that planting a pretty good pollinator garden is probably going to do a lot of good for conservation that's indirect through increasing the number of gardens on the landscape, through making more people aware of this. So if you were coming here hoping for particular instructions on how to plant the perfect garden, I've probably disappointed you, but my instruction is to plant a pretty garden with lots of wildflowers that bloom throughout the year. Try to make sure you're not buying cultivars that produce no pollen or nectar, because that's kind of a downer for the pollinators. You can go to the garden store and look at what the bees are visiting. Yeah, people will kind of look at you funny, but what that mean? Anyway, but you know, you'll be doing good just by being pretty good. So thank you all for coming here. It's so fun to see lots of familiar voices. Thanks especially to Emily and Cheryl Schultz for helping me think through the monarch butterfly situation, and to all the people in my lab group, especially those who sort of, you know, started thinking with me about pollinator gardens. And our surveys of monarchs were funded by Google. Because they care that much about whether they should be using tropical milkweed in their landscaping. So it's the first time and maybe only in my career that the corporation will be like, hey, you want a postdoc to study? Anyway, milkweed. So, and thank you, it's so fun to see familiar faces here. I don't know if you guys usually do questions or, yeah.
You mentioned that you've seen some asymptomatic monarchs that are OE carriers, and I just wonder if anybody's like looked at that and indicates like populations are building resistance.
So the question for people on Zoom, I think there's at least one or two of them, is I mentioned in passing this asymptomatic monarchs with OE. And this came up incidentally in our lab group this summer, and I need to follow up on it. But what happened is we were also doing a different project where we were introducing monarch butterflies into restored habitats, not so much like a reintroduction project, but just to see how they would use it. So we were trying to rear 50 butterflies to release and see if they would lay eggs on a milkweed and stop in nectar and stay there long enough or just fly off. And so my grad student went out to the overwintering sites to get wild monarchs, not the ones from the cities in case they were different, as they were leaving the forest because they're actually hard to find in spring. The population is smallest and it's most dispersed. So we don't really know where they breed in the spring in California for that first generation. So he went to the overwintering site, he took monarchs out of the trees, gave them milkweed to oviposit on for about a week, then released them back into nature because there were only 9,000 monarchs on the California coast this year, and we reared their offspring up in the lab. And it turned out that although we tried to be careful, you know, like we got out of 100 eggs, 80 beautiful looking adult monarch butterflies, and then he tested them for OE before releasing them, and like all the 25 of them were testing as heavily infected, even though none of us could tell that they were infected. And that's a very different message than I get from reading the work, mostly from Sonia Altheiser's lab, but there's also a guy at UGA, Andy Davis, who has strong opinions about tropical milkweed that differ from mine. So I need to go back to their papers and see if there could be this sort of hidden dichotomy where there's a lot of asymptomatic monarchs. I could also hypothesize that in California, the interaction of the overwintering and breeding monarchs is much more flexible, and there have been non-migratory ones in Southern California for a long time, and maybe they're starting to become resistant. But that is one of those surprising observations I haven't fully processed yet, but could be a really good thing to follow up on. It would be really neat if they were starting to be resistant.
Maybe I missed, but what's the life cycle of the OE protozoa?
The OE protozoa, oh, that is a good question. And I will tell you what I know about it, is that they are spread on the bodies of monarch butterflies. You test them for OE by putting tape or a little clear sticky circle on their belly. You can actually do you can get a kit from the Altheiser lab. She's still surveying them nationwide. And then you can see the spores. So those spores come off and get on leaves. Monarch butterflies eat the leaves, and then some of them are sick, but enough of them survive to spread the spore to other things. So it's not like some parasites that have complex life cycles with multiple hosts. I think it's kind of a sort of ordinary disease that sometimes kills its host, but not often enough that it can't keep spreading.
So it's host specific.
Yes. I think that is true. I cannot think of another. It might spread to queen butterflies that are closely related to monarchs, but it's not going to be spreading to cabbage whites and ringlets and pipeline swallowtails.
Christine on Zoom has a question. They said, my neighbor tends to buy beautiful hanging baskets of flowers that I imagine are full of pesticides. Am I right to worry about these flowers killing my pollinators?
So that is a really good question. So the question, probably everyone could hear it, but was their neighbor buys baskets of beautiful hanging flowers that she imagines are full of pesticides. Pesticides in the horticulture industry are really hard to regulate. They ship plants in all kinds of containers. You know, you can try to get neonic-free plants, neonicotinoid, this particularly bad insect pesticide, but they probably still have fungicides. Very few people sell organic native plants. And in the survey of milkweeds in California, the ones labeled as pollinator friendly were actually a little bit more likely to have other pesticides like fungicides on them. So, I will only, so pesticides are everywhere, and as a society, we can change that. As an individual, I certainly wouldn't be going to yell at your neighbor about their plants. What I would say is that it's hard to say if there's a little bit of pesticide and the pollinators are visiting it, whether that's bad or good. We did once have an experience rearing monarch butterflies where we bought a bunch of beautiful plants from a nursery. We brought them home, we were gonna feed them to the monarchs, and then they both broke out in a fungus, and the caterpillars didn't want to eat them. And I think I said the word wrong. First, the caterpillars didn't want to eat them, and then they broke out in a fungus, and we hypothesized that although the nursery we got them from pesticide free, they had ordered from a supplier that had used fungicide. But we saw immediately those little caterpillars dying. I'm very lucky I had a great field tech who was like, this caterpillar doesn't like this plant, I'm taking it off. I'm going outside and searching until I find a patch of wild milkweed so I can feed it. She was an amazing person for both noticing that so quickly, so that we didn't lose a cohort of caterpillars. These were the offspring, the ones that were too infected to rear, the uninfected parents, and we were trying to get some butterflies. And anyway, she saved them. So I would say watch for really strong effects. Try to buy as organic as you can, but don't yell at your neighbor for something unless you see the insects dying.
Do microphone and resident monarch populations interact well?
That is, I mean, almost certainly they interact a little bit, but it's really hard to tell how much they interact. Classically, the only way you could tell if they were migratory or resident was by killing them. And doing the kind of stuff that I showed you from that slide in Georgia, where they would analyze their chemistry to see what species of milkweed they grew up on. It's actually kind of cool that milkweeds have different chemistry. You can separate them out that way, but it's then hard to know how much they were interacting because you killed them. There's not even genetic differences that people can use to get at their origin because it's, anyway, there's not strong genetic differences that will tell you where they're from, because they have this weird migratory life cycle. So I've talked to the people who are working on those techniques now, and they're trying to get something where you can do a wing punch. And if they get it, their idea is because we often put stickers on the wings, so people can tell us if they see a butterfly, you do a wing punch, you cover it with a sticker on each side. And if we get that technology going, we can start to look more directly at their interactions. But it's hard to believe, especially in California, the overwintering sites might only be a few miles from the gardens where they're hanging out. Surely someone is leaving the overwintering site and nectaring. Surely some of the overwintering monarchs that they found that were dead had been eating tropical milkweed. So we know that some went from the tropical milkweed to the overwintering population. I'm not sure those data have been published yet, but so don't go calling the press. They're not my data. But yeah, so they interact some, but we don't know how much. And it's actually really hard to study because they don't differ morphologically, they don't even easily differ genetically.
Yeah, I think you had mentioned I think it was 2008 or maybe it was 2018, maybe it's that difference. You said that monarchs in California, they developed a year-round population further north. Do you know what the reason for that population establishing was? Is that a climate thing, or is that because there's more evergreen milkweed plants being planted in that region of California? Do you know what the reason is?
Yeah, so I don't know the history for sure. So the question was, why did those monarch butterflies start spending the whole year in the San Francisco Bay Area instead of staying down in LA and Santa Barbara and San Diego? And I don't know the answer, and probably no one knows the answer, but my guess is that people have been planting tropical milkweed for a long time, not even thinking about monarch butterflies, but because it's a pretty shrub with orange flowers. And then we crossed a climate threshold, would be my guess. And suddenly it was warm enough most years for monarch butterflies to breed in the winter, and the milkweed was there. So that's my guess.
I was curious, you mentioned, milkweed, which is second on here, but in it popped up, I think it's a different genus, so is it a true milkweed, or is it not, and if it's not a milkweed, do they still use it in the same way that they do milkweed?
Yeah, so the question was, tropical milkweed is a spookiest, just like all our native milkweeds, and it's also from North America, like Mexico and Central America. And blue plant milkweed is from Africa and it's a different genus, and it is a different genus. I believe they're reasonably closely related. They have the same carotenoid glycosides, same chemicals that monarchs sequester and make them not taste good and get written up in introductory biology textbooks. And we see monarch butterflies making it through their life cycle on those plants in coastal California. If someone has thoroughly analyzed the relative quality of bloom plants versus native milkweeds, I haven't found that paper, but they seem to be fine host plants for monarchs. So, yeah, I'm fine with all the caveats that come with evergreen non-native milkweeds. People have in lab studies looked at tropical milkweed and native milkweed, and except for all these concerns about migration and infection, tropical milkweed is a fine host plant for monarchs. In fact, infected monarchs might do a little bit better on it because it has more carotenoid glycosides. Okay, well, it is a little after 8:30 and I don't see any more questions. Thank you all again for inviting me here. It's been really fun.
Yeah.